Hello and welcome. My name is Pino Migliorino and I'll be convening and moderating this webinar today. And welcome to this webinar. ANROWS, the organisation who's hosting this webinar, is seeking to support the launch of its NCAS NCAS National Community Attitude Survey report, looking specifically at the attitudes towards violence against women and gender equality among people from non-English speaking countries. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people of the Kulin Nation, whose land we are hosting this webinar on, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands you are participating on, and pay my respects to all their elders past, present and emerging. Well, today's webinar has been organised to introduce you to the attitudes towards violence against women and gender equality among people from non-English speaking countries report. As you can see, it's a very long title, but I'm not comfortable with the acronym either, so I'm happy to consider this to be the report which looks at the particular attitudes and issues relevant to people born overseas in looking at the overarching NCAS report, the National Community Attitude Survey. We'll do this through a range of presentations today and discussion. Now, just to let you know, thank you for so many of you who have registered and already given us questions you'd like to address. Rather than identify them specifically, we've made them available to the panel and made sure that those particular and pertinent to specific approaches and topics have been read and will be reflected on in the presentations. After we do a range of presentations, I'll introduce the panel, and before I do that quickly, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Pino Migliorino. I am proud and honoured to be on a director of the board of ANROWS and have been in that role for nearly 4 years. But my interest in this area is not new. I am a community advocate around gendered issues. I am a researcher and communicator, and I'm passionate about this issue and the need for an evidence-driven approach to addressing behaviours which are unacceptable when it comes to the treatment of women and children in violent environments. I'm absolutely honoured with our panel today, and I'll introduce them now. I won't go through their CVs because I know they're available to you in the material made available for the webinar, but I'd very warmly like to welcome Dr. Cathy Vaughan from the University of Melbourne, Dr. Jasmin Chen from the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health. Welcome both of you. Ms. Madhuri Maske from the Brotherhood of St. Lawrence. And finally, Mr. Sean Ryan. And Sean is a recent graduate of a AMES program, which is geared towards supporting and mentoring potential leaders around the prevention of violence against women, and it's called the Prevention of Violence Leadership course, and so we're very, very happy to have you as well. So with very little further to do there, the report itself is a significant piece of work. It draws out from the major research those issues which are pertinent to called communities, especially those targeted, which are those who are born in mainly non-English speaking countries. For those of you who have had an opportunity to look at some of the material, it is extremely complex, it's extremely well written and extremely nuanced in terms of both what the issues are and how we should be dealing with them. But I won't continue to talk because we have Cathy here who knows far more about it, being part of the research team that delivered it, Cathy. So Cathy, could I ask you to tell us about the new report? And I won't mention it again, we've heard it, but yeah, I'd love to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, Pino. As Pino mentioned, I'm based at the University of Melbourne, and much of my research has been with migrant and refugee women around experiences of violence. That includes the ANROWS-funded Aspire project and the current Muses project. It's also been a great pleasure to work with ANROWS on the NCAS. NCAS is the longest running survey of community attitudes towards violence against women in the world. It's been running since 1995, and there's been periodic waves of data collection ever since. In the most recent 2017 survey, the NCAS was funded by the Australian Government and led by a terrific ANROWS team in collaboration with researchers at the University of Melbourne, the University of New South Wales, RMIT University and the Social Research Centre. I want to acknowledge the incredible work of that ANROWS team, and in particular Kim Webster, who led the project and is the lead author of the report we'll be talking about today. My role with the NCAS was as a member of the survey's advisory groups, and in particular in contributing to this report by contextualising it in the wider literature on violence against migrant and refugee women, and in working with the core research team in relation to the implications of the findings. So the NCAS is designed to tell us about people's attitudes of and understanding of, attitudes towards and understanding of violence against women, about attitudes towards gender equality, and about what influences those attitudes. And it enables us to track change over time in knowledge and attitudes among the community. Today we'll be talking about the data that was collected through telephone interviews in 2017, the most recent wave of the study. In 2017, thousands of randomly selected people were contacted by telephone, and that's both landline and mobile, and invited to participate in a telephone interview, and then the appointment was made for an interview at the time. 17,500 people who were aged 16 and over completed those interviews, so it's a fantastic sample of across the Australian population. Findings from that whole sample have already been published and are available on the main ANROWS website, along with a detailed report on the survey's methodology for anyone out there who's particularly interested in methodology. And there are also reports based on a subsample of interviewees who were young people and from an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander background. Of the 17,500 people who were interviewed in the NCAS, 2,926 identified as having been born in a country where English is not the main language spoken. In the report, that is referred to as an NMESC, and I know that's not an acronym many people are aware of, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. The report is specifically looking at, that we'll talk about today, specifically looks at those 2,926 interviews. So obviously violence is used against women across the population, regardless of which country they're born in. So you might be asking, well, why look at the attitudes and knowledge, particularly of people born in an NMESC? But international research shows that there's considerable variation in the prevalence of violence against women between different countries, and in the factors that influence knowledge and shape attitudes towards violence against women and gender inequality in different countries. And then when in Australia, proficiency in English substantially influences access to information and services, as all of us know very well, and this in turn shapes knowledge and attitudes. So preventing violence against women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds is a national priority, so it's also important to produce evidence that can inform that prevention work. So NMESC is not a familiar term for many of us. Most of us use terms like migrant and refugee background or culturally and linguistically diverse, but it is actually the most accurate description of the sample of people we're talking about in this report. Everyone who completed the survey, those 17,500 people, were asked their country of birth. The NMESC sample is everyone who was born overseas, except for those who were born in the UK, Canada, the US and New Zealand. The NMESC sample represents 16.7% of all people who completed the interviews, which is actually just a slightly higher proportion of the Australian population who was born in an NMESC, which is 16.2. So there's quite good representation in terms of absolute numbers. People may be wondering, though, whether the sample is representative of the Australian population who don't speak English or don't speak English very well. In this wave of NCAS, interviews were offered in English and in 12 other languages. That's Mandarin, Arabic, Vietnamese, Greek, Cantonese, Spanish, Korean, Italian, Punjabi, Turkish, Tagalog and Thai. So there was the opportunity for people to participate in an interview in a language other than English. Okay, so getting on to the findings of the report. So just by way of background, there are three things that I think it's really important to highlight. First of all, overall, people born in an NMESC or in a country where English is not the main language support gender equality and have a good understanding of the nature of violence against women. So overall, I think that's a really positive finding from the report. However, while overall levels of knowledge are good, only 60% of people interviewed would know where to seek advice and support for a domestic violence situation. And that, I think, is important for all of us who are working in practice to be aware of. Secondly, the majority of people who are born in countries where English is not the first main language spoken have attitudes that reject violence against women, and that's important to highlight. And that's the majority, but there is a sizable minority that tend to blame victims and excuse perpetrators of violence. And this can be seen in responses to statements like, a lot of what is called domestic violence is really just a normal reaction to daily stress and frustration. So people who agreed with that statement, that's really sort of normalising and minimising violence. Or there was higher levels of agreement amongst a sizable minority of people interviewed that excused domestic violence of either the victim or the offender was heavily influenced by alcohol. A minority also had attitudes that minimised the impact and the consequences of partner violence and sexual violence, and suggesting it wasn't as serious as we all know it is. Finally, while the majority of people born in a country where English is not the main language spoken have attitudes that support gender equality, there is a concerning minority who hold attitudes that promote rigid gender roles, both for women and for men, and that undermine women's independence and decision-making in both public and private life. And this can be seen in responses to statements like a woman has to have children to be fulfilled, or that men rather than women should hold positions of responsibility in the community. So there are, I think, three important messages. Overall good, but that there is a sizable group where attitudes and knowledge are not where we would like them to be. Of course, people born in countries where English is not the main language are highly diverse. And in thinking about interventions, it's important to do analysis within that NMESC sample to guide thinking about where to target programs. We can't do this by country of birth, because once you break down that sample of not quite 3,000 people into all the individual countries in which respondents were born, the numbers get too small to draw statistically valid conclusions. However, we can look at different demographic factors that apply across the whole sample, such as age, gender, education, and so on. Doing that, we find that men are more likely than women to have lower levels of knowledge about violence against women and to hold negative attitudes about violence and gender equality. We also find lower levels of knowledge and concerning attitudes to be more often reported by people who've arrived in Australia in the last 5 years, by people who don't speak English well or at all, by people who are working in male-dominated industries such as driving, labouring, operating machinery, and also by people who live in areas with higher levels of social and economic disadvantage. Age also plays a role, with young people have slightly lower levels of knowledge, but with people over the age of 65 less likely to support gender equality and more likely to endorse attitudes that support violence against women. So, I guess in concluding, overall, the majority of people born in countries where English is not the main language have a good understanding of violence against women and positive attitudes, but the data do highlight areas of concern and groups with whom it would be important to focus interventions. I really want to acknowledge that migrant and refugee women have been leading work to prevent violence and promote gender equality in their communities for decades, and it will be important to listen to their experience about how these focused interventions could best be developed. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from some of them later in this discussion. Thanks, Pino.
Well, thank you, Cathy. I mean, it is a significant report. To the way you've presented it and summarised it, I just think speaks to the quality of the people working on it and the very key points that you're making. So thanks for that. It's interesting too because it is an attitudes survey. Yep. And so I think what's important for us to then explore what are the links between attitudes and behaviour. And I suppose it's a question I put to you, Jasmin, in terms of why is it important to address attitudes?
Thanks, Pino. Yeah, it's a really good question. Thanks, Cathy, so much for that. Yes, so I am the Research Advocacy and Policy Manager at Multicultural Centre for Women's Health, and we're really pleased to see the release of this data and really happy to be part of this conversation about how it's going to inform the work that we're doing to prevent violence against women. So thanks so much, Pino, and thanks to ANROWS for inviting me. Attitudes are really important, and I think especially those of us who've had a chance to read the wider National Community Attitudes Survey, it already explains quite a lot about the links, but there are a number of reasons why attitudes are important for us to look at in our prevention work. So we know that there are many factors that contribute to violence against women, and that's quite complex. But when we're looking at the population level of change and what we can do to prevent violence before it starts, the attitudes that as you were saying, Cathy, that condone violence, that excuse violence, that undermine women's independence and reinforce rigid gender roles. All of those types of attitudes really create the conditions in which violence is more possible and more likely to occur, sort of almost creating a climate in which in which violence is possible. And so from that perspective, I think when you look at Change the Story, the national framework, and Changing the Picture as well, they both really show us that gendered inequality is a fundamental driver of violence against women. So in our prevention work, it's really important that we are addressing that. Part of addressing that is, of course, looking at the unfair distribution of opportunities and the unequal conditions that create gender inequality in the first place. But also, the other very important part of that is challenging and changing the attitudes that really support and reinforce those systems and conditions. So, so having the NCAS and then having this data is really informative for our work and how it's going to guide our prevention work, the messages that we're going to focus on, and the types of tailoring we're going to do. Of course, gendered inequality isn't the only driver of violence, and I think Changing the Picture really illustrates very powerfully how gendered inequality intersects with the ongoing impacts of colonisation on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the impacts on non-Indigenous people to drive violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And I think in a similar way, one of the most interesting findings for me about in this report and in the wider report is that one of the 6 strongest predictors that somebody is going to have attitudes that support violence is that they have prejudicial attitudes to people on the basis of other attributes. So I think it was the questions or the surveys were on ethnicity and race, ability, sexual orientation and Aboriginality. So that to me is a really clear indicator that we need to be working to address all kinds of discrimination and prejudice as part of our work of really addressing violence against women and preventing violence against women. So that's a really exciting finding for me. And I suppose for immigrant and refugee communities that are doing prevention work, or for prevention projects that are specifically looking at immigrant and refugee communities, having this evidence base that's supporting and really acknowledging the need for tailored responses, tailored approaches and strategies to work with different communities, I think is really brilliant to have. And it's a real opportunity for us to reflect on the approaches that we're taking, how we might change the messages or just refine the messages. And it's also, it might be a fantastic benchmark for us to measure our successes in the future. So, yeah, it's fantastic to have the research.
I think you have certainly positioned it that it's not an issue that stands on its own, and the intersectionality of it is something that needs to be understood as well. But I think from the perspective of what the report does, it actually says that we have to particularly target issues or attitudes within individual cultural communities without necessarily naming some as being more or less pertinent to the topic. It actually has to be done within a cultural framework. And so I'm really pleased that our next 2 speakers are actually going to be talking about doing violence prevention work, and I think that's going to be really important. And just before I do that, the way we'll also finish off the webinar is we'll go through these presentations and discussions, then I'll ask some questions, and then I'd like to open up to you if there are any particular questions or issues that the presenters or the commentators are actually making that you'd like to ask a question on. Please feel free to send it through. They're going to be moderated and they're going to pop up on my screen here. So it'd be great to hear from you if there's anything at all. So with that editorial and comment in between, I will move to you, Adori. I'm really interested then in the work you've been doing with the Brotherhood of St Lawrence around, quite specifically around prevention.
Thank you so much, Pino. First of all, I'd like to thank ANROWS and Pino yourself for inviting me in this platform. This is really a good opportunity to share our experiences through many audience out here. As you've said, I'm Madhuri. I'm working with Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, leading Safer and Stronger Community Pilot Project for prevention of family violence among refugee and migrant community. So I'd like to give a little bit of background of mine. So before Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, I've spent about 19 years in community development sector, especially serving most vulnerable and disadvantaged community back in Nepal. And coming back to Australia, so I've started this prevention work based on my past experience. And I'm also actively engaged in Nepalese community to support them in addressing many social issues, which is also related to family violence and equality. So both like professionally and voluntarily, I'm engaged in this work. I've started my role with Brotherhood of St. Lawrence since 2018. So this project started from October 2018, and I'm really feeling privileged to be part of Brotherhood of St. Lawrence because this poses a strong and long history of fighting for prosperity of the country, and then better services for people from migrant and refugee community. So at its growth, it has widened and expanded, strengthened its community outreach program for youth engagement, economic security, social inclusion, and empowerment, and then sustainable services target to people from migrant and refugee background. So when I talk about Brotherhood of St. Lawrence, it held really strong commitment for preventing family violence with our previous CEO, Tony Nicholson, being Deputy Commissioner to Royal Commission. So in response to Royal Commission recommendation to family violence, Brotherhood of St. Lawrence has been focused on increasing staff capacity to respond and recognize family violence through family violence initiative since 2017. And which also include implementation of policy, tools, procedures, including training for staff. And in addition to this, since October 2018, Brotherhood thought like we really need to invest in prevention. So we've had a partnership with Department of Premier Cabinet, and we've started implementing this project aiming to build attitudinal and behavior change that require to prevent family violence and deliver gender equality. So we have, this project is getting support from prevention experts like ANROWS and Multicultural Center for Women's Health. And Melbourne University is also a part of this in evaluating this project. So this project has two major components. The first one is workplace equality and respect component, which has internal focus on organizational and workforce capacity building with and understanding that workplace has an important role to promote gender equality and influencing attitude, behavior, social norms and structure that allow violence to occur. And the other important part is community outreach component, so which has focused on building the capacity of migrant and refugee communities to design and deliver prevention strategies and activities to address attitude, beliefs, and behavior that we have been talking through to lead family violence and violence against women. So to address those aspects like attitude, belief, and behavior which lead to family violence. So we are working together with selected community, selected migrant and refugee community in Hume and Whittlesea. So when we talk about the family violence issue in migrant and refugee communities, I hardly see any proven differences in the incidents between this community. However, the intersecting factors relevant to the experience of family violence in refugee community is really different, really high, which includes like diverse migration pathways and traumatic pre-arrival issues as well as settlement issues, and then which again contribute with social isolation, language barrier, and again new cultural and social environment to the country. And then the other important thing is uncertainty of the immigration status that has largely impact on the context of family violence in this community. There is like when it comes to reporting of the cases, it is very low in this community, because like they assume their experience of family violence may not be recognized as a violence or may be ignored. So they don't know, they have lack of information, and they fear of adverse consequences such as being punished by withdrawal of entitlements, or maybe they may face strict work requirement. And again, due to uncertain immigration status, they fear of being getting deportation from the country. And they also have fear of further violence from their partner being known to them, like they have disclosed this. Therefore, we are focusing on migrant and refugee community to make them more aware, make them comfortable, develop that trust, so that we can work together in terms of design what sort of prevention strategy we can deliver into the community, so that in the context of community it is culturally sensitive, culturally acceptable, and it is themselves designing these prevention strategies which has better impact in the community. So we are in a very initial stage of bringing community together to discuss on what are the particular issues within the migrant and refugee community in those particular community, and how we can work together to help this community. So this project is all about that.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Pino.
If there's time, I'd be really interested in terms of some of the particular gendered issues within that, like the response of men and women, but we might come back to that. But thank you very much. So you're fundamentally suggesting, quite rightly, that in order to do this work, you actually have to understand the conditions and the context in which the communities are living, and therefore understanding what would be those pressures. It's not excusing behaviour, but it's actually trying to understand circumstances so you can actually address behaviour.
Definitely.
And I think that speaks really, really strongly. So thank you very, very much. I'm now really interested to hear from Sean as well. Now, Sean has been a graduate, if you like, of a program run by ANROWS in terms of developing male leadership and male leaders. There's a certain movement in the whole women's violence, women and family violence area around male champions, and I know that there is some not necessarily concern. There are a number of ways of looking at it, but certainly this is not an issue which can be dealt with without involving men. And I'm really interested in your perspectives, both in terms of what you've actually learnt from the course and how you're actually implementing the work, that in your work.
Thank you, Pino, and thank you to ANROWS for the invitation to speak. As a graduate from AIM's Prevention of Violence Leadership course, we're asked to create a community project that's run for the next 6 months right after you graduate, and from there we did a project we incorporated a group called Break Boundaries, and we created 2 videos challenging everyday sexism, which is it's a 2-part series with culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And from there I've also worked with Health-West Partnership on a project called Project Momentum, where we recruit and train male allies in prevention of violence against women in a university context. The age group that we targeted were young male students and staff from the age of 18 to 30, whereby we give them adequate information about what prevention of violence is, what the key figures and facts and all that. And also we try to break myths by giving them the facts of what certain gender stereotype is and things like that. And we've also got recruited women to be part of the Women's Accountability Panel, whereby they keep the male allies accountable of their actions, as well as when they come up with community projects, they will have to run by the Women's Accountability Panel to get further advice, or whereby they make minor changes to their projects and things like that. And yeah, and also I think being a male ally myself, it's a bit tough, especially being in this sector, because your actions are held accountable, and if you don't do the right thing, it's gonna create a backlash for you.
So is it tough because of the women's response to you or the men's response to you?
It's more of the, I would say both sides, because when you come into this, you're always questioned on what you bring to this table, and also whether you're there for the right reasons, or you're just there for just to make yourself look good, and to so those are the things that people question. And being in this since graduating, you get that imposter syndrome a bit, whereby because sometimes you question yourself as well in terms of why you're doing this and where you want to be in the next 5 years, or what you want to gain out of this, or what you want to contribute back to society. And yeah, and also looking at the news as well, and seeing a lot of prominent figures being called out, so those are the things that you don't want to be. You always try to make yourself, you want to educate yourself more on this, and also being more of an ally, instead of just saying I'm here as a manager, this is how it is, and this is how you got to listen to me, kind of thing. So yeah.
So, there are so many other questions I would ask you, but I think it would be unfair to the rest of the panel. I'm interested in maybe being a little bit more provocative with this, because the reality is there's always this sensitivity in terms of reporting research which is specific to ethnic communities, in this case people born in mainly non-English speaking countries. Because while we need the evidence base, there's also the risk that the evidence actually can be used in a negative way to feed stereotype, to feed stigma, and to potentially even have the reactions that we do not want. So I am interested in an open question to the panel, which is very much this: how can we work? Now, this is a big piece of work with a lot of information, and I know that if I wanted to be quite particular in how I reported this in the negative, there's stuff for that. I wouldn't shout 75% of men. I would say 1 in 4, and I would be able to emphasise that. So I am interested in how can we work to ensure that these research findings are not misused or quoted out of context. Who'd like to start?
This is another big question. I can start. There's a lot that we could say, and probably, it's a big conversation, but I think, and I do think the report's been really careful when you look at, if you don't just flick through the stats and you actually read the analysis and the conclusions of the findings. I think there's a lot of work that's been done to frame the statistics. So it's, for a start, I'd say read the whole report, because I do think that there's that the researchers have gone to quite a lot of trouble to make sure that they contextualise, and also to acknowledge that the survey tells us what people think, but not why. And that is really crucial, and the why it is sort of speaks to all of the things that you were talking about, Madhuri. There are multiple kind of contexts and frames that that might be the reason why people have said that they hold these views in this survey at this time. And I think it's really important that we don't equate the idea that what was said in this survey in particular, because it's focusing on the non-main English speaking background people, that if they hold views that were supportive of violence, that it's because that they are from non-main English speaking backgrounds, where it might be despite the fact that they're from non-mainly English speaking backgrounds, or it might be that they there are so many other reasons why they might hold those views that are not necessarily connected with the fact that this is the data set that's been drawn. So I think that's, I'm not sure if that's part of
I think it is
an answer,
about giving it a perspective, and the way you've mentioned that, in spite of rather than because of, I think is a necessary one.
Yeah.
We are trying to understand a grouping, not because the grouping, I mean, we're saying here that this group is almost one, and we know it's not. The only thing that actually combines them is the fact that they've actually migrated here from a country which doesn't speak English. And they could be as diverse as any group of people. But what it does do is, if it actually suggests that people who do come to Australia do tend to either work within, reflect, connect, deal with community structures, or actually live parts of their lives in terms of a linguistic and cultural framework, then it's important for us to be able to do that, and that's where that goes. Other views, and could I just say, we had a comment come through that unfortunately, just as you were finishing, Cathy, the link dropped out. So the areas that you're identifying in terms of what are the pointed, if you like, the most likelies, the most likely list didn't go through, but rather than get you to do it again, it will be available on the website in terms of the full recording of this. But and maybe just quickly, it was about recent arrivals, low levels of English proficiency, low skilled male-dominated employment, experiencing disadvantage, and some older and younger age cohort issues.
And men.
And men. And men. So coming back to it, so we're actually saying, okay, it's important we don't necessarily categorise the behaviour because of the ethnicity or the background, but what happens if I am one of those shock jocks, or I get this report and I want to actually drive a point? How else can we actually frame it, and how do we respond to that?
I mean, I think one thing that is important in thinking about the data is that I'm glad we're not talking about cultural and linguistic diversity, because everyone has a culture, and the dominant culture in Australia also includes many barriers to gender equality, and we have a high prevalence of violence against women amongst people who are born in Australia, who, you know, for all sections of the Australian community. So I think that's one thing that is really positive about the way that the report is framed, and not using culture in that way. I think that, and it's also because it's statistically not possible to look at country of birth, but what it does allow us to do is look at where there might be higher needs for information, for services, for prevention initiatives, and by working with communities that have got a high proportion of new arrivals in the last 5 years, that's, I think, an important approach out of this report, because that is something that we've found, and that's been repeated over the few waves of NCAS, is that, and we've done analysis too, or the NCAS team rather, have done analysis to look at the different, the differences you might think is to do with different groups of people migrating to Australia, but by combining data from new arrivals from the same country from a number of years, you do get to a point where you've got enough numbers to look at the impact of acculturation and of length of time in Australia, and it really does make a difference. So that first period of time in Australia is a really key time, and the development of English language proficiency is also a really important thing that needs to be focused on. But I think MCWH have made the really important point that we can't wait until everyone's got highly fluent English, or that we've got more funding for English language programs, which is an ongoing challenge, but that it really highlights the importance of in-language resources, in-language initiatives, bicultural workers, bilingual workers, that is key to prevention work.
There is a quick question on the panel asking around, could you please describe the acronym you're using, so it's very clear. So this is the mainly non.
So it's an awkward acronym. So it's N-MESC, non-mainly English-speaking countries. So it's people who are coming from countries where English is not the main language spoken. So it's basically all countries except for people who, people who were born in Australia are not included in this sample, but also people who were born in the UK, in New Zealand, which is those two countries make up a very substantial proportion of people born overseas in the Australian population. It also excludes people born in Canada and the US.
Thank you for that.
Yep.
So I'm going to go to you, Madhuri, because this is an important question for us in terms of would a community which is nominated feel threatened if we actually went public with this type of information? What would be the community response?
A bit, yes, because when I'm sharing my experience when I was scoping about the community to implement this project. So when I went and met the community and started discussing about we would like to work together with you in the space of prevention of family violence, then they said like, why you are coming to us? Yeah. So is it like our community has, like high prevalence of family violence? So they felt like they were tagging in. Then I said like, no, it is not the case. But then it is because of you, particularly your community has a highest population, demographic representation in the country. And this is important for everybody. It is not only to your community. And it is like, for me, it is easy, like SAC's project it is Victoria-wide. So it's so easy for me to say it is Victoria-wide. It is for all community, irrespective of who you are, need to know about family violence prevention. And as you said, like data, like ANROWS, this research data, I don't think it'll be misused, but then there's possibility of misinterpretation. So when I talk about violence against women, then people started saying like there is increase in incidence of violence against men. So what do you say about that? And definitely yes, there is increasing, but then we have to then talk about the data, what data says, what are the percentages of women experiencing family violence and then men experiencing family violence. It is very different. So we need to deal that way. So we need to interpret very clearly to the community like why we are focusing on violence against women. It is because there is violence against men, but then majority of the cases are male perpetrator. So data are very useful, but it depends how we interpret to convince community to understand that. And then once they understand, they are there like to support. So that is my experience. Yeah.
What is the danger of this report in the type of work you do?
I think one thing people question is they want to know the breakdowns of the communities. That's always the question, like, oh, how many percentages from that community, how many percentage from this community? And I think what we're trying to do is not, as you said, be specific and say, this affects all community across the board. And the same thing with international students as well, because international students, one thing they need to understand is what is sexual harassment, what is sexual abuse on campuses and things, and also uni lodges and also the services provided, because when students come here, not many people want to give them that. It's more of mental health, how to get from uni from the first year to the third year. But this report helps in terms of getting them to understand what is going on and also helping them break it down into their languages. So that's where the key resources will be easy for practitioners to, especially bilingual or bicultural practitioners, to explain it to them in a simple way, by just using the graphs and the figures instead of just giving them the whole report, just breaking it down and saying, this is how, you can educate yourself and get there.
And
Cathy?
I think one of the challenges and one of the ways you can also respond to people who are saying, well, which countries? We want to know about countries, because country of birth is such a blunt instrument.
Yes.
There are people, very large proportion of people who were born in, say, Egypt or Kenya, who might come from a whole range of countries around that country.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly.
one challenge. Whose kind of ethnic background is from a range of other places. But also within countries, there's such incredible diversity. So, for example, India, massive population, incredibly diverse, lots of different languages spoken. We have migrants who come to Australia from India who have got primary school level education, and others who are surgeons and who are, so to homogenise people all as the same on the basis of country of birth also doesn't make sense. And looking at other things like recency of arrival, proficiency in English, helps target more usefully than just country of birth, which is such a kind of blunt tool and not necessarily accurate in terms of thinking of developing programs that you guys all run.
Yeah, there always is that if you like, potential risk that we're seen to almost be apologetic for that difference, and I think it's something we really do need to claim, especially in ethnic communities.
Not that easy.
Being a male in my own community, it's certainly my responsibility to own the issue.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I think the other thing that really needs to be said in this context, we need this data to be able to look at where we need to target more programs with the nuanced approach. What are the types of things that you're currently doing it? I've quite often find it a bit concerning that as soon as you do that, then we forget that the issue of domestic and family violence exists everywhere. It does not have an ethnicity. It is about it is about gender, and it is about power. And I think it's really incumbent on us to say we have the right to be able to do this, not because we want to stigmatise, but because we actually need the capacities and the tools to be able to deal best with issues as they present themselves. In the same way as we're doing in the general community.
Correct.
It's exactly the same issue. And I think with the suggestion, Cathy, that there may be a time where the data sets will allow that longitudinal understanding, I think are fantastic. Because the reality is migrants come here from a range of different cultural and linguistic traditions, a range of different community structures and mores and approaches. And the acculturation process is a reality. I sit here as a product of that. A child who came here in a very strong traditional Italian family where there were incidents of family violence, but now, what is now a 55, 60-year period, it would be absolutely abhorrent to anyone in not only my family, but my community in terms of this area. So we have to acknowledge that we have to have the capacity, the evidence and the tools to actually target. And I think what comes out really strongly in the report is a real belief that it's important because it says quite categorically, if you're going to go out with general information to the public on these issues, you will miss these communities. It has to be articulated and has to be precise. Now, I'm interested now, we've got roughly about 10 minutes. I'm going to ask you what your top tip would be for working with migrant and refugee communities in the area of violence against women. So we've got an evidence base, we know that the programmatic approaches are there. What is your top tip? What will work, you believe? Who would like to start?
I think Maduri nailed it. Actually, it's asking the community. It's making sure that whatever prevention activities or strategies you have, that they're community led and led by women in the community. Love that accountability panel. You know, it's about making sure that it's that everybody's on board and that it's a community grounded activity. I think that's all you have to do.
Okay, well, I will actually stop it there, and I'm changing a little bit of course because a number of questions have come through, which is great. And so what I'd like to do is thank you formally for the presentations and allowing me to interrogate some of the information. It's been extremely on the mark and very, very pertinent. So I'd like to thank the panel. And what we will do in a few seconds, then we'll go to the question and answers. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Pina.
you.
Thank you.
Well, thanks again. We've got a couple of questions here. Some are directed, and I think I will start with one, which was one that I actually mooted before. It's to you, Maduri. How do you see the men's role in community to reduce the cases of family violence, and how do they need to be engaged so they are part of the process? So, which is exactly the question I said I was going to answer.
Yeah, and this
Thank you. Thank you, Sandeep.
this is very important question, and so until now in the development process, women are more mobilized, more empowered, and then men are left apart in the development process. So. And majority of the perpetrators are male. This is the fact.
Yes.
Like we can't say no. This is the fact. But then the another fact is they can bring this change. So that is the fact. And how I am approaching to the community, especially male group, is yes, violence is happening. Male are the perpetrator, but then you can bring this change. You have this power to bring this change, and many of you who are already, like role model for gender equality, you can come in front, and so that other male can learn from you. So that is how I'm trying to engaging them, getting their trust. Yeah, male on male, getting their trust and giving them that comfortable environment. Like, yes, we're not blaming as a perpetrator, but then now we are a change maker in this space of family violence.
Is there resistance? And how does that manifest itself?
There is a resistance, because change is always not easy thing, and it is of course a power sort of things, and they feel like when they act on promoting gender equality, they feel like they will lose their power.
Yeah.
But if we've been able to clearly make them understand, like if they can maintain that gender equality, that respectful relationship within their family, how it will impact the future of their children and generation to generation is enormous.
Yes.
So we really need to make them understand, and there's small effort in preventing family violence, like respecting women in the family does have long-term effect in the society. Yeah. So that is how I'm discussing, doing conversation with the male members, and I have a community advisory groups, and some male members are really like keen. So, are you serious? Like, do we have a role in family violence prevention? Definitely, we would like to be part of it.
So it's like you've invited them in?
Yes, I have invited the men. Yes, definitely. So already started.
Okay.
And men are already discussing like how we can contribute to the community. And then slowly they are, realizing, they are sharing the experience. Yes, we have a family violence. In the initial stage, when I was scoping about the community, then discussing about family violence, they said like, it's a very sensitive issue. We shouldn't talk about. And with men, no, not at all. They feel offended. But then now I've been in that situation, like men are saying, yes, we should work together. So I'm really happy, quite excited, though I'm in the very initial stage, but then I'm feeling quite positive, and I'm feeling like, men's engagement is really important, and we can.
I think it's really interesting because it does play into how they see themselves in the context of their migration to Australia as men as well. And you touched upon it, and there's a question very much which looks at the impact of racism on both communities and men in terms of how that interacts with this issue.
Yeah.
Rashmi has asked that question. I'd be really interested in your perspective, Jasmin.
So the question specifically was around
I'll read it out to you, probably the best way. It goes, can you comment on what might be the impact of racism on attitudes towards gender equality and violence against women amongst people from non-mainly English-speaking countries?
It's a really good. It
doesn't have to be you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear what other people think. But I mean, I suppose there are multiple potential impacts of racism and gender, and I'd love to hear what you all think. I suppose one that stands out to me is that the racialisation of gender norms has impacts on both men and women, and it affects the ways that that we can talk about gender inequality, I think. So, for example, particularly the vilification of the Sudanese community more broadly, but then also the ways that men in those communities are positioned as with this heightened sense of the potential for violence is really damaging. It's really creates more risk and danger for those men in being subjected to violence as well. So it's a really destructive force, but it also prevents the rest of the community from feeling like they can have those conversations about gender, because it sort of compounds this, you know, so it stops conversations. That's not the only thing that the intersection of racism and gendered inequality does, but I think that's one thing that stands out to me as really, really dangerous and creating a lot of risk for people in those communities.
Would anyone else like to comment? Yourself, Cathy?
I would just say that from the statistics, there is an association between a range of forms of prejudice and negative attitudes around violence against women across the whole sample, whether they're people born in Australia or born elsewhere. So that's an important thing to note. And then the other thing I'd think about with racism is in relation to socioeconomic and economic disadvantage. So people living in disadvantaged areas, sometimes that disadvantage is stemming from experiences of racism and discrimination, so people not being able to get employment, not being able, a whole range of barriers to moving out of an area where there's high levels of social and economic disadvantage can be associated with racism, and we know that living in a more disadvantaged area is associated with negative attitudes. So I think that, you know, addressing that will be an important part of contributing to reduction in negative attitudes.
Thank you. Sean, any comments from you on that? So it's particularly and I'm interested, I wanted to frame it maybe from a male perspective. It's an important one because, and maybe thinking about it, when you said before some of the men were surprised that they were allowed to participate, are we having to deal with the expectation, almost a prejudicial expectation, that men from certain backgrounds behave in certain ways? And it's almost like a queuing effect. So I'm lucky, my cultural stereotype has moved from being dirty and grubby to now being cultural icons because we like style and coffee. So it's pretty easy to adapt to that now. But there was a time when the labelling was quite tough. I mean, is that part of the problem, that we're almost queuing behaviour, the expectation that certain cultures behave in certain ways? Have you felt that in terms of coming a bit more forward in terms of addressing these issues?
I think throughout this journey of mine, there's this thing called the male privilege. There's always that, you know, that word male privilege, and to a person from a non-main English speaking country, it's different. You know, because for us, we don't see it as male privilege, it's just privilege, you know, and we get to see, you know, do things that other people can't do. And you know, by being on this journey, you see that you have power over that, and you can either use it for good or bad. And you know, so it's their choice, you know, what they want to do. And I feel like you have the power to do good, and it's an important thing, you know, because it's violence does not discriminate gender, you know, it just happens. And whether you're, you know, so those are the kind of things that I feel when it comes to racism, it's a big thing, and we all face it on a daily basis, especially international students, because one thing is, oh, you're here because if you don't leave after graduating, you're here to take my job, you're here to, you know, so those are the kind of things.
So you've got some of those economic overlays as well.
So for us, we try to push it to the back of our heads, minds, is because we're here to gain something, you know, so experience, work experience is the main priority for us. It's not about taking someone's job or, you know, because there are reports that, you know, international students are not taking your jobs. It's just that we are also facing unemployment.
I think you're creating a fair few jobs as well.
Exactly.
But can I just take out of that? I think it's a really good point, and I do want to emphasise, if indeed in culture there is a male privilege, what we need to be able to do is turn that and activate that privilege so it actually works against the issues around domestic and family violence, which is exactly what you've said. And I think that's a really good point. We're almost at the end, and I've got literally 45 seconds to wrap up. I have been asked when will the report be available. It is available, and it'll be available on the ANROWS website, as will a recording of this webinar. And I don't know if I'll look at it, but I think we've done fairly confidently. I've even held the pencil like a good anchor would. So I'm hoping that the presentation has been as informative as it needed to be for you. I'd like to thank the participants, Cathy, Jasmin, Maduri and Sean. I really appreciate the honesty of the approach. You've allowed me and the ANROWS to ask you to present on some what are sensitive issues. You use that word. And that notion of sensitivity is an important one because it should be how we frame our responses. If it wasn't sensitive, we could advertise it in the supermarket. It is sensitive, we have to work through community. And that's exactly what you've said. So there's also a resource list which will be available. I think I've gone through it again this morning. It's fantastic. And equally, there will be a database that you can put your name onto in the contact sheet. We currently don't have a violence technical word is we don't have a network database on this yet, but we are building a series of contacts through the contact sheet process. So I'd like to thank you for your time. I hope you've found this interesting. I suggest that you read this at depth and with a view of how we can use this to actually create the change we want. And I think if I'm going to finish it off, I'm going to finish it off by saying there is no cultural defence to violence against women and children, and that's clearly the framework we have to work within. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.